Something unexpected begins to happen the deeper you go into self-awareness. At first, growth feels liberating. You start recognizing your patterns. You understand your emotional reactions. You see projections more clearly. You feel less controlled by unconscious impulses. There is a sense of clarity that feels almost relieving, as if something that once confused you now makes sense. And in those early stages, awareness feels like freedom. But there's a point in psychological development where that feeling begins to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, almost imperceptibly. The same awareness that once felt light begins to feel heavier. You may notice this in subtle ways. You catch yourself in a familiar reaction, but this time, you cannot ignore it. You see the pattern as it's happening. You recognize the defense mechanism in real time. And something inside you becomes uncomfortable, because now you know. Before, you could react and later justify it. Now, the justification feels thinner, less convincing. You begin to realize that awareness removes a certain kind of psychological escape. And this is where many people encounter a shift they were not prepared for, because growth is often presented as something that makes life easier, more peaceful, more aligned. And while that is partially true, it is not the whole truth. Consider what happens in a simple real-life situation. You're in a conversation with someone close to you. They say something that triggers irritation. Earlier in your life, you might have reacted immediately, raised your voice, defended yourself, or withdrawn. And afterward, you explain your reaction in a way that protected your sense of self. They were wrong. They pushed me. That's just how I am. But now, something is different. You feel the irritation rising, and at the same time, you recognize it. You see the underlying sensitivity. You notice the part of you that feels threatened. You recognize that your reaction is not only about them, it is also about something within you. And in that moment, you are faced with something new, a choice. You can still react, but you can no longer pretend you don't see it. And that changes the entire experience. Because the reaction now carries awareness, and awareness introduces responsibility. Another example appears in quieter moments. You find yourself repeating a familiar pattern in relationships, perhaps choosing similar types of people, perhaps avoiding certain kinds of emotional vulnerability. Earlier in life, these patterns felt like circumstances. Things just happen this way. This is just who I meet. But after doing inner work, you begin to see the pattern more clearly. You recognize the consistency. You notice the emotional dynamics. You see how your own behavior contributes to the outcome. And again, something shifts. Because once you see the pattern, it is no longer something that simply happens to you. It becomes something you are participating in. And that realization carries weight. Carl Jung believed that one of the central tasks of psychological development is to make the unconscious conscious. But he also understood something that is often overlooked. When something becomes conscious, it does not just become visible, it becomes your responsibility. This is a part of growth that is rarely emphasized. Awareness does not only expand perception, it reduces innocence. You can no longer claim the same level of unconsciousness. You can no longer fully identify with the idea that things are simply happening to you, because now you see your role, and that seeing changes your relationship with your own behavior. You may begin to notice this in moments of self-reflection. You think back on a situation where something went wrong. Earlier, your focus might have been entirely external. What the other person did, how the situation unfolded, what went against you. But now, your reflection includes something else. You begin asking, what was my part in this? Where did I react unconsciously? What did I avoid seeing? These questions represent real growth, but they also introduce a certain psychological pressure because they remove the comfort of simple narratives. Life becomes less about blame and more about participation, and participation requires accountability. This is why awareness can begin to feel heavier over time, not because something is wrong, but because something has become clearer. You are no longer navigating life entirely through unconscious patterns. You are seeing those patterns as they operate, and seeing creates a different kind of experience. It creates responsibility. You may notice a shift in how you respond to your own emotions. You feel anger rise. But instead of being consumed by it, you observe it. You recognize its source. You understand its triggers. And because of that understanding, something changes. You cannot fully justify the reaction in the same way. You see the layers beneath it. You see the vulnerability, the fear, the expectation. And now, the anger is no longer just an external reaction. It becomes an internal signal. And signals ask to be understood, not acted out blindly. This creates a subtle tension, because part of you still wants to react as before. But another part of you sees too clearly to allow that reaction to feel entirely valid. And this is where awareness begins to feel like a kind of weight, not a burden in a negative sense, but a weight in the sense of increased psychological gravity. Your actions carry more meaning. Your reactions carry more context. Your choices carry more consequence. Carl Jung understood that as consciousness expands, the individual becomes more ethically engaged with their own life, not necessarily in a moralistic sense, but in a psychological sense. You become more aware of cause and effect within your own psyche. You see how your inner state influences your outer reality. You recognize how unconscious patterns shape your decisions. And once you see this, something changes. You can no longer move through life in the same automatic way. You begin to pause more, reflect more, question more. And while this leads to greater depth and maturity, it also removes a certain simplicity. Life is no longer just experienced. It is also observed. And observation introduces responsibility. You may even notice this in your internal dialogue. Earlier, you might have had thoughts that passed without much examination, judgments, assumptions, emotional conclusions. Now, those same thoughts become more visible. You catch them, you question them, you examine where they come from. And this creates a different relationship with your own. You are no longer fully merged with your thoughts. You are aware of them. But that awareness also means you cannot ignore them as easily. You begin to see when you are being unfair, when you are projecting, when you are avoiding something. And each of these moments presents a subtle choice to acknowledge or to turn away. And over time, these choices accumulate. They shape your sense of integrity because awareness naturally leads toward alignment. When you see something clearly, there is an internal pressure to respond to that clarity, not perfectly, but honestly. And honesty requires effort. It requires confronting parts of yourself that are not always comfortable. It requires taking responsibility for things you might prefer to avoid. It requires letting go of certain illusions. And illusions are often what make life feel lighter in earlier stages. This is why many people experience a kind of paradox as they grow. They feel more grounded, but also more aware of complexity. They feel more stable, but also more responsible. They feel more conscious, but less able to escape themselves. And this is not a regression. It is a transition, a movement from unconscious living to conscious participation. Carl Jung's entire philosophy of individuation points toward this process. Becoming more whole does not mean becoming more comfortable at all times. It means becoming more aware of the totality of your psyche, the light and the shadow, the conscious and the unconscious, the parts you accept and the parts you would rather not see. And as these elements become visible, something shifts in your relationship with yourself. You can no longer claim ignorance. You can no longer say, I didn't know, because now you do know, at least partially. And that partial knowing is enough to change everything, because it introduces responsibility, not imposed from outside, but emerging from within. You begin to feel accountable to your own awareness. And that is where growth takes on a different tone. It becomes less about improvement and more about integrity, less about feeling better and more about being honest, less about escaping discomfort and more about understanding it. This is a subtle moment where awareness stops feeling light and begins to feel real, not heavy in a way that weighs you down, but heavy in a way that grounds you, like something has become more solid, more undeniable, more present. And recognizing this moment is important, because without understanding it, you may misinterpret the feeling. You may think something has gone wrong. That growth has made life harder. That awareness has taken something away. But in reality, something deeper has been added, the capacity to see. And with that capacity comes the responsibility to respond. A deeper layer of psychological change begins when awareness stops being something you use and starts becoming something that evaluates you. At first, self-awareness feels like a tool. You use it to understand your emotions, to navigate relationships more effectively, to avoid repeating painful patterns. It feels like something you can apply when needed. But as your consciousness expands, something subtle shifts. Awareness is no longer something you turn on and off. It becomes constant. It becomes present even when you wish it wasn't. And this is where many people encounter a second, more complex stage of growth, because awareness begins holding you to a standard that you did not consciously choose. You may notice this in moments where you act in ways that contradict what you already understand. For example, you find yourself reacting defensively in a conversation. Your tone sharpens. Your body tightens. Your words become slightly more aggressive. But this time, something is different. You are aware of it while it is happening. You see the defensiveness. You recognize the insecurity behind it. You understand the mechanism. And yet, you still react. This creates a very specific kind of internal tension, because now your behavior and your awareness are no longer aligned. Earlier in life, that misalignment could go unnoticed. Now, it becomes impossible to ignore. And after the moment passes, something stays with you, not guilt in a superficial sense, but a deeper recognition. I knew better. This realization introduces a new psychological dynamic. You're no longer only responsible for what you do. You are responsible for what you understand. And this distinction is crucial because understanding raises the internal expectation, not imposed by society, not enforced by others, but generated by your own consciousness. Carl Jung emphasized that increasing awareness brings the individual into a more direct relationship with the self. The self, in Jungian psychology, represents the totality of the psyche, a deeper organizing principle that extends beyond the ego. When you are less conscious, the ego operates with relative autonomy. It reacts, it defends, it adapts, often without much internal resistance. But as awareness grows, the ego comes into contact with something larger, something that observes it, something that reflects back its inconsistencies. And this is where the experience of responsibility deepens, because you are no longer only acting from the ego, you are also witnessing it. And the witness does not forget. Consider another real-life situation. You are in a professional environment. A colleague makes a mistake that affects your work. Your immediate reaction is frustration. You feel the impulse to criticize, to point out the error, to assert your position. Earlier in life, you might have expressed that frustration directly, without much reflection. But now, multiple layers appear at once. You feel the frustration. You recognize it. You understand its origin. You see how your own expectations are contributing to the intensity. You become aware of how your reaction might impact the other person. And in that moment, several possibilities open up. You can still react harshly, but you are aware of the consequences. You can choose to respond more constructively, but that requires effort. You can suppress the reaction, but that may create internal tension. And suddenly, what once felt simple becomes complex, because awareness expands a field of perception, and with expanded perception comes expanded responsibility. This is one of the least discussed aspects of psychological growth. More awareness does not always make decisions easier. It often makes them more nuanced, because you see more variables, more layers, more implications, and this can create a sense of internal pressure. You may begin to feel that you are constantly being observed by your own consciousness, that there's a part of you that notices everything, your reactions, your thoughts, your inconsistencies, and this part does not disappear. It remains present. Carl Jung described this as a movement toward greater integration between the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. As more unconscious material becomes conscious, the individual gains insight. But insight also removes the ability to remain psychologically passive. You can no longer simply act without awareness. Even when you try, the awareness remains in the background. This creates a new kind of experience, one where you are both the participant and the observer of your own life. And this dual position changes everything, because the observer introduces accountability. You may notice this in how you relate to your own patterns over time. A behavior you once justified becomes harder to repeat without discomfort. A defense mechanism you once relied on becomes more transparent. An avoidance pattern you once ignored becomes more obvious. And with each of these recognitions, something shifts. The space between knowing and doing becomes more visible. And that space becomes one of the central challenges of advanced psychological growth. Because awareness alone is not transformation. Seeing something clearly does not automatically change it. And this can be deeply frustrating. You may find yourself thinking, if I understand this, why do I still do it? This question appears often at this stage, and it reveals something important. There is a difference between intellectual awareness and embodied integration. Carl Jung emphasized that true individuation is not simply about becoming aware of unconscious material. It is about integrating it. And integration takes time. It requires repeated confrontation, repeated recognition, repeated effort. But during that process, awareness remains active. And that means you are continuously aware of the gap between your current behavior and your deeper understanding. This gap can feel uncomfortable because it challenges your sense of coherence. You see yourself in two ways at once, as someone who understands and as someone who still struggles. And holding both of these realities requires psychological maturity, because it would be easier to collapse into one side, to either deny your awareness or judge yourself harshly for not fully embodying it. But neither approach leads to integration. This is where responsibility becomes more refined. It is no longer about immediate perfection. It is about sustained honesty. You acknowledge what you see, even when you cannot fully change it yet. You take responsibility for your patterns, even when they persist. You remain engaged with your own development, even when progress feels slow. This kind of responsibility is different from external obligation. It is internal. It is quiet, but it is consistent. And over time, it shapes your character. You may notice that your relationship with excuses begins to change. Earlier, excuses may have felt convincing. They provided relief. They protected your self-image. Now they feel less solid because you see through them. You recognize when you are rationalizing, when you are avoiding, when you are shifting blame. And even if you still engage in those behaviors, you cannot fully believe them anymore. This creates a kind of psychological friction because the old mechanisms are still present, but their effectiveness has diminished. And this is part of the transformation. Carl Jung believed that the expansion of consciousness inevitably creates tension because it brings opposing elements into awareness. The desire to change and the resistance to change. The understanding of a pattern, and the continuation of that pattern, the intention to act differently, and the habit of acting the same. Holding these opposites is not easy, but it is necessary, because this tension is what eventually leads to integration. Without awareness, there is no tension. Without tension, there is no transformation. So the discomfort you feel at this stage is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that consciousness is active, that you are no longer completely identified with your patterns, that you are beginning to see yourself more fully. And seeing yourself fully includes seeing your contradictions, your inconsistencies, your unfinished processes. This is why awareness becomes a kind of internal standard, not in a rigid or perfectionistic sense, but in a reflective sense. You begin to measure your actions against what you know to be true, not externally defined truth, but internally recognized truth. And that measurement is ongoing. It does not switch off. It accompanies you in conversations, in decisions, in moments of reaction, in moments of reflection. And over time, this continuous awareness reshapes your relationship with yourself. You become less tolerant of your own unconsciousness. Not harshly, but honestly. You begin expecting more from yourself. Not because you are trying to be perfect, but because you see more clearly. And clarity naturally calls for alignment. This is the stage where growth becomes less about discovery and more about embodiment, less about learning new concepts, and more about living what you already understand. And this is where responsibility reaches a deeper level, because it is no longer about what you are unaware of. It is about what you are aware of, but have not yet fully integrated. And navigating that space requires patience, consistency, and above all, honesty with yourself. A decisive transformation begins when awareness is no longer satisfied with being acknowledged and starts demanding to be lived. Up to a certain stage, psychological growth is largely about recognition. You notice patterns. You understand your reactions. You identify your defenses. You gain insight into your behavior and the behavior of others. And for a time, this feels like progress, because it is. Understanding brings clarity. Clarity brings a sense of orientation. You feel less lost inside yourself. But eventually, something begins to shift again. Understanding stops feeling like an achievement and starts feeling like an obligation. You may notice this in subtle but unmistakable ways. You reflect on a recurring pattern in your life. Perhaps it is a tendency to avoid difficult conversations, or a habit of withdrawing when things become emotionally intense, or a pattern of overextending yourself to gain approval. You understand the origin of the pattern. You see how it developed. You recognize how it plays out. And yet it continues. At this stage, the issue is no longer lack of awareness. It is lack of alignment. And this is where psychological growth enters one of its most demanding phases. Because once understanding is established, the psyche begins expecting something more, not intellectually, but behaviorally. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation is not a theoretical process. It is lived. It requires that the individual gradually align their actions with their expanding consciousness. And this is where many people encounter a kind of internal confrontation, because insight without action begins to create pressure. You may feel this when you repeat a behavior you have already analyzed many times. There is no confusion about why it happens, no mystery about its origin, and because of that, the repetition feels different, less like a mistake, and more like a choice, even if that choice is influenced by habit, fear, or resistance. And this realization changes your relationship with your own patterns, because once something is seen clearly, continuing it unconsciously becomes more difficult. You begin to feel the dissonance more intensely. Consider a familiar real-life scenario. You know that you tend to avoid expressing your needs in relationships. You have reflected on it. You understand that it comes from a fear of rejection, a desire to maintain harmony, a reluctance to create conflict. All of this is clear to you. And then you find yourself in a moment where expressing your need would be appropriate. The opportunity is there. The awareness is present. But hesitation arises. You feel the old pattern activating. The impulse to stay silent, to minimize, to adjust. And in that moment, something becomes very clear. You are standing at the intersection between awareness and action. Earlier in your life, this moment might have passed unnoticed. Now it becomes unmistakable. You see the pattern. You feel the fear. You recognize the choice. And whatever you do next carries a different psychological weight. If you remain silent, you know why. If you speak, you know what you are confronting. And this is where responsibility deepens again, because awareness has removed ambiguity. You are no longer acting in the dark. You are acting in the presence of understanding. Another example appears in how you manage emotional reactions. You recognize that certain situations trigger disproportionate responses. Perhaps criticism feels more intense than it should. Perhaps you become defensive when your competence is questioned. You understand that this reaction is connected to deeper insecurities. You have explored it, reflected on it, made sense of it. And then it happens again. Someone offers feedback, and you feel the familiar tightening, the urge to defend, to explain, to protect your image. But now, something else is present. You see the reaction as it forms. You understand it as it unfolds. And in that moment, the experience is fundamentally different from before, because now, the reaction is no longer automatic. It is visible, and visibility introduces responsibility. You may still react, but you cannot fully justify the reaction in the same way, because part of you knows what is happening. And this is where the psyche begins pushing toward alignment, not through force, but through tension, Carl Jung described this tension as part of the individuation process. The psyche naturally seeks wholeness, and wholeness requires coherence between what is conscious and how one lives. When there is a gap between awareness and behavior, tension arises, not as punishment, but as a signal that something is not yet integrated. This tension can manifest in different ways. You may feel a subtle dissatisfaction with yourself, not in a harsh or critical sense, but in a quiet, persistent way. A sense that you are not fully living what you understand. You may feel it after certain interactions, after moments where you acted against your own awareness, after situations where you avoided something you know you need to face. This feeling is not accidental. It is part of the psyche's movement toward alignment, and this is where growth becomes less comfortable, because alignment requires change, and change requires effort. It requires confronting fear, breaking habits, tolerating discomfort, and this is where many people encounter resistance, not because they lack awareness, but because living that awareness demands something from them. It asks them to step into unfamiliar territory, to act differently, to risk different outcomes. And even when the direction is clear, the execution is not always easy. This is why awareness alone is not the final stage of growth. It is a threshold, a point of transition, from seeing to becoming. Carl Jung believed that the self represents a potential for wholeness within the psyche, but that potential must be realized through lived experience, not just understood conceptually. And this is where the ego plays a crucial role. The ego is responsible for action, for decision-making, for navigating reality. And as awareness expands, the ego is gradually asked to align itself with the deeper intelligence of the self. This alignment is not immediate. It is a process. And during that process, there will be inconsistencies, moments where you act in accordance with your awareness, and moments where you fall back into old patterns. This is natural. But what changes is your relationship with those moments. You no longer dismiss them. You examine them. You learn from them. You take responsibility for them. And over time, this repeated engagement begins to reshape your behavior, not through force, but through consistency. You may notice that certain patterns begin to lose their strength, not because you have eliminated them completely, but because you are no longer unconsciously reinforcing them. Each moment of awareness creates a small shift. Each conscious choice reinforces a different direction, and gradually, these shifts accumulate. This is how integration happens, not through sudden transformation, but through repeated alignment. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation is a lifelong process. There is no final state where everything is perfectly integrated, but there is a continuous movement toward greater coherence, greater honesty, greater alignment, and this movement is sustained by responsibility, not imposed responsibility, but chosen responsibility, the willingness to live what you see, even when it is difficult, even when it challenges even when it requires stepping into discomfort. This is a stage where growth becomes deeply personal, because it is no longer about acquiring knowledge. It is about embodying truth. Your truth, the one you have discovered through reflection, experience, and awareness. And embodying that truth requires something simple but demanding: consistency, not perfection, but consistency. The willingness to return to awareness again and again, to correct yourself when you deviate, to remain engaged with your own development. And this is where the real depth of psychological maturity begins to appear, not in what you understand, but in how you live. Because in the end, awareness is not measured by what you can explain. It is measured by what you are willing to align with. And alignment is where consciousness becomes real. There comes a stage in psychological growth where the question is no longer whether you are aware, but whether you are willing to live according to that awareness. By this point, something fundamental has changed inside you. You are no longer navigating life blindly. You see patterns as they emerge. You recognize your reactions as they form. You understand the deeper layers behind your behavior. And because of this, a certain kind of innocence has disappeared, not in a negative sense, but in a clarifying one. You can no longer fully return to the version of yourself who did not see, and that realization carries a quiet finality. Carl Jung described individuation as the process of becoming who you truly are, but this becoming is not a single moment. It is not a breakthrough that resolves everything. It is an ongoing relationship between awareness and action, between what you see and how you choose to respond to it. At earlier stages, growth feels like discovery. You uncover parts of yourself. You make sense of your experiences. You begin to understand the structure of your inner world. But eventually, discovery is no longer enough, because once something is seen, it begins asking something of you, not loudly, not forcefully, but persistently. It asks for alignment. And this is where the real discipline of psychological maturity begins. Not discipline in the rigid, external sense, but in the internal sense. The discipline of not turning away from what you already understand. You may notice that this discipline appears in small, everyday moments. Moments that might seem insignificant from the outside, but carry deep psychological weight. A moment where you feel the urge to react impulsively, and instead you pause. A moment where you want to avoid a difficult conversation, and instead you stay present. A moment where you recognize a familiar pattern, and instead of following it automatically, you question it. These moments are not dramatic. They do not feel like major transformations, but they are where real change happens, because they represent alignment, the willingness to act in accordance with awareness. And over time, these moments accumulate. They shape your character. They define your relationship with yourself. They determine whether your growth remains theoretical or becomes real. Carl Jung emphasized that the goal of individuation is not perfection. It is wholeness, and wholeness includes contradiction. It includes inconsistency. It includes moments where you fall back into old patterns. But what changes is how you relate to those moments. You no longer ignore them. You no longer fully justify them. You recognize them. You take responsibility for them. And then you return to awareness again and again. This returning is the essence of the process. Not getting everything right, but staying engaged, staying honest, staying willing to see. Because the psyche does not demand perfection. It demands sincerity. And sincerity means that you do not hide from yourself, even when what you see is uncomfortable, even when it challenges your self-image, even when it reveals that you are still in process. This is where humility naturally emerges, not as an idea, but as an experience. You begin to understand that awareness does not elevate you above others. It deepens your responsibility toward yourself. You see more, so you are accountable for more, not in comparison to others, but in relation to your own consciousness. And this removes a certain kind of illusion, the illusion that growth is about becoming better than you were. Instead, it becomes about becoming more honest than you were, more aligned, more present, more real. Carl Jung often pointed toward the idea that the unconscious is inexhaustible, that no matter how much you discover, there will always be more to uncover. And this realization changes the entire orientation of growth. You stop aiming for completion and start engaging with process. You stop trying to arrive and start learning how to remain aware while moving, because there is no final state where responsibility disappears. There is only a deepening relationship with it, and that relationship becomes part of your identity, not as a label, but as a way of being. You begin to trust your awareness, not as something that judges you, but as something that guides you. You begin to rely on it, to listen to it, to act in accordance with it, even when it is inconvenient. And this is where psychological maturity stabilizes, not in constant clarity, but in consistent engagement. You remain in dialogue with yourself. You continue observing, reflecting, adjusting, and over time, this creates a sense of integrity, a quiet alignment between what you know and how you live. It is not perfect, but it is real, and that reality becomes its own form of stability. Before we close, consider this carefully. Have you ever noticed a moment where you knew exactly what you were doing and still chose it anyway? A moment where awareness was present, but alignment was not? What happened in that moment? And what would it have required to choose differently? Take a moment to reflect on that, because that space, between what you see and how you act, is where your real growth is happening. If this resonated with you, Share your experience in the comments, not as a statement of success, but as an honest reflection of where you are in the process. Someone reading your words may recognize the same struggle within themselves, and that recognition may help them stay engaged with their own awareness. Because in the end, this path is not about becoming flawless. It is about becoming responsible for your consciousness and continuing to choose it, even when it would be easier not to.